In his book The Oath, legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin describes the rocky relationship between President Barack Obama and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. Interestingly, Roberts inadvertently botched the oath that he administered to President Obama during the inauguration. Article 2 of the Constitution makes an explicit reference to the oath, which must be taken before a president officially takes over. It is noteworthy that the Founding Fathers actually make reference to this oath in the Constitution. While the precise words of the oath have varied over time, the Constitution nevertheless says that an incoming president shall take the oath of office before he enters on the execution of his office. Because Chief Justice Roberts had botched the oath up so badly, President Obama's advisors were worried that this might prove to be a distraction. For example, what might happen if a federal district judge decided to hold a hearing on this? Obviously, this would prove to be very embarrassing, especially considering the fact that President Obama made commitment to the rule of law a centerpiece of his campaign. So Obama's advisors contacted Chief Justice Roberts in order to redo the oath and get it right the second time. In a way, this illustrates the tumultuous relationship between the President and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, two of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C., and the United States for that matter. While it is true that Barack Obama and John Roberts went to Harvard and acted as editors of the Law Review, this is where the similarities end. In fact, it is fair to say that these two gentlemen have far more differences than similarities. Roberts, for example, grew up in a middle-class background. He attended a private Catholic school for boys and was the valedictorian of his class. Barack Obama, on the other hand, had been abandoned by his father at an early age and was raised by his grandparents in Honolulu. Immediately out of law school, Barack Obama worked with the inner-city poor, while John Roberts served as a law clerk for Chief Justice Rehnquist before taking a position in the Attorney General's office during the Reagan administration. Roberts would go on to serve the Reagan administration and the George H.W. Bush administration in the Department of Justice and the Office of the White House Counsel before spending 14 years in private law practice. Meanwhile, Barack Obama would become an Illinois state legislature and then a U.S. senator representing the state of Illinois. These two gentlemen would have considerably different career paths, but as we shall see soon, their paths would cross before Chief Justice administered the oath of office in 2009. It is important to point out that President Obama and Chief Justice Roberts are both honorable and intelligent men. They just happen to see the Constitution in different ways. Interestingly, in his book, The Oath, Jeffrey Toobin writes that Barack Obama never seemed to believe that the courts were the principal vehicle for social and political change. Obama had grown up respecting Chief Justice Earl Warren, who helped to orchestrate massive social change by rendering landmark decisions. However, as Toobin points out, Barack Obama believed that elections rather than court decisions would be the best way to influence policy. In fact, in his book, Toobin insinuates that Obama did not fully trust the judiciary to do the right thing. This may be due in part to the fact that Obama, as a young man, watched the very conservative Rehnquist court hand down rulings which often favored states' rights and to some extent the power elite. As an up-and-coming leader in the Democratic Party, Obama believed that there was really only one way to ensure that justices on the Supreme Court would protect the poor and the downtrodden. He believed that once the Democrats won the election, the new president could then nominate justices who had liberal values. As you read Toobin's book, it is important to understand the point that he makes regarding Barack Obama's view of the court. Toobin writes that to Obama, the court system is not necessarily the best institution to redistribute wealth. Obama did not truly believe that the courts could deliver social change. Instead, he believed that this was up to the power of the legislature. This is actually consistent with what the Founding Fathers of the Constitution wanted. For example, if you look at Article 1 of the Constitution, which defines the powers of Congress, you will see that it is much longer than Article 3, which creates the judicial branch. So even though Barack Obama admired liberal Supreme Court justices such as Earl Warren and Thurgood Marshall, he believed that the court system was not the best way to achieve social change. He would have a short tenure as a legislature. However, this was basically a way to allow him to run for president. As mentioned above, Barack Obama and John Roberts would meet in 2005, 4 years before Roberts botched the oath of office. As a senator, Barack Obama voted not to confirm John Roberts as Chief Justice to the Supreme Court. In his book, Toobin argues that this mainly had to do with politics. After all, Obama knew that he was going to run for President of the United States one day. Therefore, if he had voted to confirm Roberts to the Supreme Court, this would have undoubtedly hurt him in the Democratic primaries. Incidentally, Hillary Clinton also voted against John Roberts in the confirmation hearings. 4 months later, both Obama and Hillary Clinton would vote against Samuel Alito when he was nominated to the Supreme Court. Both Roberts and Alito were nominated by President George W. Bush, and as we know, both of these conservative justices were eventually confirmed by a majority of the Senate and appointed to the bench. When John Roberts became the new Chief Justice in 2005, 45% of the cases were decided unanimously in the first year. Generally, only about a third of all cases by the U.S. Supreme Court are decided unanimously. Roberts, who is a natural leader, seemed initially to do a very good job of building coalitions across party lines. Of course, the court would eventually start to be more divisive. For example, in Hamden versus Rumsfeld, the Supreme Court, in a 5-3 decision, held that military commissions set up by the Bush administration try detainees at Guantanamo Bay lacked the power to proceed because the structures and procedures violated both the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the Geneva Conventions signed in 1949. Chief Justice John Roberts actually recused himself from this case, but the voting patterns are such amongst the remaining justices that they were predictable. And Justices Scalia, Alito, Thomas, who are the three most conservative justices on the bench, all voted in favor of the Bush administration. Ultimately, though, the liberal justices would prevail. This is largely due to the fact that Justice Anthony Kennedy provided the necessary swing vote. Kennedy is a conservative on some subjects. However, he is definitely to the left of Scalia on issues such as the death penalty and gay rights. Justice Kennedy is also known for citing the laws of other nations in his opinions, which has incensed Justice Scalia from time to time. In his book, Jeffrey Toobin also provides a discussion of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a liberal Supreme Court justice who was nominated by President Clinton and appointed to the court in 1993. Ginsburg is currently the oldest of the Supreme Court justices. As of the fall of 2012, Ginsburg was 79 years old. Before becoming a Supreme Court justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg lobbied on behalf of equal rights for women. Interestingly, one of Ginsburg's larger goals, of course, was to make sure that they were given equal rights, and one of the strategies that she used was to sue on behalf of male plaintiffs, not just women. And this, of course, was to see that men and women were treated equally under the law. Ginsburg obviously is going to be one who favors abortion rights or the right to choose. She believes that these are about equality more than anything else. In 2007, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act in a case known as Gonzalez versus Cahart. This case upheld the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act, which was signed into law under President George W. Bush. The court upheld this law, which essentially states that any physician who knowingly performs a partial birth abortion and kills a late-term human fetus can be imprisoned up to 2 years. Regardless of how one feels about abortion, there is at least one thing that many scholars have found to be unsettling about Gonzalez versus Cahart, and that is that all of the voting of the U.S. Supreme Court justices occurred along party lines. For example, Roberts, Scalia, Thomas, and Alito, by far the most conservative justices on the court, voted to affirm the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act. These justices were joined by the moderate conservative Anthony Kennedy. All 5 of these justices were nominated by a Republican president, and the 4 justices who dissented in this case were regarded as liberal justices. For example, Justice Ginsburg and Justice Breyer, who dissented, were nominated by Democratic presidents. Justice Stevens and Justice Souter also joined Ginsburg and Breyer, and even though Stevens and Souter were appointed by Republican presidents, they were still very liberal in their decision-making, and both were very liberal in their decision-making throughout their careers. In his memoir, Justice Stevens says how he was a Republican, and it's true, he was appointed by a Republican, but his voting pattern while he was on the bench during his career really doesn't reflect the Republican ideology. I think it's much more fair to say that he was liberal in his voting patterns. And David Souter, who retired recently, was especially liberal, in spite of the fact that he was appointed by George H. Bush. Some scholars have asked, why do Supreme Court justices even bother to write dissenting opinions? Well, the answer is fairly straightforward. A dissent in the Supreme Court is, in a sense, an appeal. In a dissenting opinion, a justice believes that an error has been made, and we know that some of the most famous dissenting opinions have been vindicated. For example, the infamous Dred Scott decision, which permitted slavery, has obviously been overturned, and Plessy versus Ferguson, a case which affirmed the separate but equal doctrine, was overturned by the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education. The fact is that many conservatives today are adamant that Roe versus Wade, the case which made abortion legal, was a mistake. This represents, I think, a huge problem for any Republican who wants to become president. The fact is that Republican presidential contenders have to be against abortion in order to win the primaries. The problem, however, is that this puts them at an enormous disadvantage and makes Republican candidates less competitive in the general election. The majority of voters in this country are women, and regardless of what women may say in public, it is likely that privately the majority of females in this country do not want the government to have control over their bodies. For this reason, as well as others, women overwhelmingly voted in favor of President Obama in the last presidential election.